Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Helion virtual book launch. Some of you may have been expecting Duncan Rogers based on the advertisement, our director. I am not he. Regrettably, Duncan has been called away. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Adrien Bamford, and I look after the 18th century and the Napoleonic titles for Helion. So I am completely out of my depth with this topic, and I'm very shortly going to be introducing the two experts who you've all come here to listen to. We've got about 100 people registered for this, and I can see from the count that I get as admin that there are people still filtering in. I'm just going to take the opportunity to talk for a few moments, just for the benefit of people who aren't familiar with the Demio platform that we're using, and just to give you an idea of how the session is going to work. So you've all done the hard bit. You followed the link and got into Demio, and you can hopefully hear me, and I can see people are joining in on the chat already. So that's the hardest bit done. The beauty of Demio is that it's a browser-based conferencing platform. So any problems that you have should be rectifiable by refreshing your browser. Either in the most simple way of simply clicking on the refresh at the top of the screen. If you're really struggling, you may find it's worth closing your browser and coming back in through the link that you joined by, and that'll take you straight back in again. If that still doesn't work and you have more than one browser installed, it does on occasion perform better on some browsers than others. So you may find switching to another browser is the way to resolve things. Obviously, if your internet cuts out, then I'm sorry, there's not a lot we can do about that. I can only advise that sit as close to your router as possible. But of course, everybody who's registered will get a recording of the whole session. So if you do find you miss any portion of tonight through connectivity issues, you'll be able to catch it up on the recording. In terms of the format, we've got two speakers tonight, two of the authors of the War in Ukraine Volume 2, but we've got Tom and we've got Adrien, and they're going to be speaking to you shortly, and then taking questions at the end of the session. In terms of how the Q&A is going to work, obviously you guys in the audience are not able to come on stage and ask questions. It's not like a Zoom conference where you can do that. So what I would ask is if you can post your questions in the chat that you've been using to introduce yourselves. I can then with the magic powers of the administrator, I can flag those as questions, and I can read them out at the end. Just to make my life a little easier, if a question occurs to you while Tom and Adrien are talking, put it in the chat. If they subsequently cover that point, then I simply won't ask the question. But it saves me getting a deluge of questions at the end and having to field new questions while I'm reading out the ones that we've already got. So as I say, if you ask them as they occur to you, and then hopefully we can whip through the Q&A. Uniquely for this one, we've actually had some questions sent in advance, so I'll probably start off with those as well, just to give people a little bit more time to formulate their thoughts and ask any questions that they might have. Last thing from me in terms of admin before you get the people that you came here to listen to, there is a discount code exclusive to people who've signed up for this event. I've posted it in the chat, and I'll continue to post it at intervals throughout the evening, just so it doesn't get lost in all the conversation, and that will give you £5 off the book when you order it from the Helion website. There is currently a launch offer on the book, which will give everybody that, but this will run for rather longer until, if you excuse me, it will run until midnight GMT on the 16th of April. So you've got a little bit longer by virtue of having come tonight. But hopefully you've already all bought the book because you're clearly fans, and you clearly want to listen to Tom and Adrien. To which end, I will therefore invite them both to come and join me on the stage. Just bear a moment while technology happens, and then I will disappear, and our two speakers can enlighten you for the next 20-30 minutes or so. So we have Tom, and hopefully we have Adrien in just a moment. Let's Just try that again. There we go. Lovely. Good evening, gentlemen. I don't think either of you need anything by way of introduction. I can see applause in the chat already, but simply for your presence. So I think Tom's going to kick things off. I'm going to disappear. So Tom, over to you, and then when you're both finished, I'll reappear and we'll do the Q&A session. But the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for introducing us and for welcoming everybody. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you in such numbers around. Great to have this opportunity to talk about our newest book. Before I go on, if you don't mind, I would like to talk a little bit about the At War series and how and why and what are we doing here. As you can see, we started publishing these books already in 2012, so it's already 11th year of them coming out, and there are no less than 6 different series, including Africa at War, which was the original, the first one. It was followed by 3 additional ones in 2014. That was Asia at War, Latin America at War, and Middle East at War. Then 4 or 5 years ago, we have launched Europe at War, and this year we are preparing an entirely new series called Technology at War. The essence is coverage of contemporary warfare, which means primarily warfare since 1945. But we are not covering these wars exclusively. We sometimes venture into earlier warfare back to 1918. So it depends on what is the topic, how topical it is, how interesting it might be, and so on and so on. This is what we are doing. And in between, as can be seen here, we are frequently actually covering ongoing wars, not only wars fought 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but also ongoing wars. We did so already at the start. One of the early volumes of Africa at War was France in Centrafrique, which means French influence in Central African Republic. In similar fashion, we have covered in a total of 4 volumes the complex of wars in Uganda, in Rwanda, and then in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think it was in 2015, we have launched the first of volumes covering the Syrian war, Syrian civil war, if you like, in form of Syrian conflagration. In 2018, so only 3 years after the start of the Russian military intervention in Syria, we have launched Moscow's Game of Poker, which is widely appreciated really as a book covering this intervention in very detailed fashion and not available anywhere else. And in between of these two, in 2017, we have published, for example, the volume 2 of the mini-series or sub-series, if you like, Hot Skies over Yemen, which is covering the warfare in Yemen since 2015. So also an ongoing war. So this means actually covering ongoing wars is not new for us, although it is quite complex thing to do. It takes extra research, extra contacts, extra knowledge about available weaponry, capabilities and intentions of all the involved parties. So it is not easy to write such books, and to make sure they are never right on the money and never perfect in terms of quality of information they are providing. Always the author has to expect that they are going to be obsolete within 5 years. Sometimes it happens that this is not the case. This is, for example, what happened with these 3 books. Surprisingly enough, no really new information has emerged ever since Syrian conflagration, Moscow's Game of Poker, and Hot Skies over Yemen Volume 2 have been published. What else can I tell you about this series? Let me go to war in Ukraine. It was already in late 2019, early 2020 that we have been contacted by Mr. Edward Croter, who was living in the Donetsk People's Republic, so-called Donetsk People's Republic, for years. And he suggested a series of books covering separatist armed forces for the start. Those of Donetsk, then Luhansk, and then going over to Ukrainian armed forces. And then further developing this series, going into details about combat operations of 2014, 2015, and to lesser degree afterwards. So we have launched this series long before Putin decided to re-invade Ukraine in February 2022. It so happened by accident that Volume 1 of War in Ukraine mini-series was then short of going to the print in February last year. Volume 2 is still under construction, as you can see it in the middle. It is meanwhile it was retitled to Volume 3, and is going to cover the composition, equipment, and the operations of armed forces, armed formations of the Luhansk People's Republic between 2014 and 22. So now, in February last year, Putin re-invaded Ukraine, and so we have said, okay, there's a lot of demand for detailed information on capabilities, on intentions, and so on. So let's expand this series and prepare a volume which would introduce our readership to the armed forces of Russia and the armed forces of Ukraine as of February 2022. And this is how the idea for what then became Volume 2 came into being. It is not like, we are some kind of war prophetess of warmongers. We can't wait for another conflict to erupt somewhere. It is so that sometimes one has to be flexible and develop the series one has started already years before events are taking place. And then you have such a situation in this case, and War in Ukraine Volume 2 came out. So what was the starting point for this book? The first issue was to find out what kind of armed forces, what kind of formations, what kind of equipment, weaponry, what was the organization, doctrine, and so on, was there in Russia, what was there in Ukraine, how did it develop, what can the Russians do to Ukraine, what did they intend to do, and the same in case of Ukrainians. What can they do with available forces, and what do they intend to do? And this is the centerpiece of this volume, to create a starting point for all the coverage which is to follow, because we intend to continue following. We are following this war, as you know, most of you know, almost day to day, and we intend to publish additional volumes, for example, about air warfare, about ground warfare, about tank fleets of both sides, about infantry weapons, artillery, and so on and so on. So this is how this volume kind of started coming into being. And then, after figuring out, okay, we have still enough space left, we have dedicated the last 3 or 4 chapters to the coverage of combat operations of the first 2 weeks of that war. That means what were the Russians planning to do, what were the Ukrainians planning to do, and how did they act, how did they run, what of operations, in what direction, and in what fashion. So this is, I don't know how much you can see on the table of contents. This is how you can see also what you can see in terms of contents of this book. There is a total of 8 chapters, with the first 4 covering the forces of Russia, the armed forces of Russian Federation, armed forces of Ukraine. We have paid particular attention to explaining how the Ukrainian armed forces developed from this decay and almost inability to operate in 2014 into what they were as of February last year. What have they changed? How did they restructure? What armament did they acquire, if any, and so on and so on. And we have also paid attention to last-minute moves of both sides. So there were plenty of adaptations in the last minute, especially at the top of the leadership in Moscow. But also in Kiev, of course, where the Ukrainian government was at first reluctant to accept the fact that there is going to be an invasion after all, and thus almost too late to mobilize its armed forces. And after that, we started, with combat operations clockwise as always, from north towards the southwest. That means the next, I think this is a chapter 5, is covering the Russian invasion of the Kiev area. Chapter 6 is covering the invasion of northeastern Ukraine, which means area of Chernihiv, of Sumy, of Kharkiv. Chapter 7 is offering an insight which is largely ignored in all the coverage of this war, namely the combat along the line of control, or along the front line of this frozen conflict for 8 years in eastern Ukraine. And finally, the chapter 8 is covering what we call the race to Odessa, which means the Russian advance into southern Ukraine, which came forward at such a high pace. So this is the book as we have put it together. The book is of course concluded also with big appendixes, including detailed orders of battle for both sides. And this is including not only the ground forces, but also air forces and air defense forces as far as possible. In the case of Russia, this was not that well possible, so we have left it out largely, but air forces of both sides are described in as much detail as possible in these regards. So this is where I'm going to forward you to my colleague and friend, Adrien Fontanellaz in Switzerland. He is going to tell us a little bit more precisely about armed forces of the two sides at the start of the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. So basically, my part of the job was to try to find out basically the status of both Russian and Ukrainian forces on the eve of the re-invasion in 2022. I have to say it was this undertaking led to quite a few surprises. The first being the different components of the Russian army. So this slide is I will not go into it into any length, but this slide is showing basically the Russian invasion force as of 24 February 2022, which is 8 combined armed army and 1 tank army. So basically the bulk of the Russian ground forces. And I guess you are all aware of this famous and famed BTG system, that is larger units such as brigades extracting all their professionals from the main unit to create battalion tactical groups, which are basically concentrating the best and most combat-ready troops for an engagement. And then out of the larger picture of the Russian army order of battle, then you see that basically they concentrated for the onslaught 3/4 of their potential BTGs, which means and it is a bit counterintuitive considering the Russian historical context. You basically the so-called special military operation was a pistol with a single shot. They dispatched away their main forces and without any way to reinforce them quickly. And so we know what happened. But perhaps even more surprising is, of course, we all knew, or at least observers of the Russian military, and perhaps for most time with his study of Russian operations in Syria beforehand, we knew that armed forces, or the army in general, or the weapon industry in Russia were a way to advertise, to promote Putin's regime, and we all knew there was plenty of problems, noticeably corruption. We knew that all weapon systems were not functioning as advertised. We knew that on the other hand, the regime was expert into self-promoting its military might, but still it was a surprise to say the Putin system corrupted the entire institution to make it almost dysfunctional. No, with inside we know that it was basically a hierarchy where everybody was lying about the real status of his own units from bottom to top. We know that even some professional soldiers have had problems to get uniforms issued, even in the elite VDV, which is saying a lot. And so most of us still, despite having some reservations about the propaganda picture of the Russian armed forces, were still surprised by the level of their unpreparedness and inability to react with reality further later into the war, which brings to and it's quite ironic, which brings to an opposite effect, that is the Ukrainian armed forces at large. It was not unanimous, but you had plenty of experts in the West, and including NATO experts, who are considering that Ukraine would be utterly unable to defend itself against the full might of the Russian armed forces. And still, whilst digging a bit through the subject, it appeared that yes, it's true that in the beginning of the war, that is in 2014, which we cannot emphasize enough, that this war began actually in 2014 and not in 2022. The Ukrainian army was in a really sorry state, if not to say a state of decay, but the crushing defeats suffered in the Donbass in 2014 and early 2015 in a lesser extent generates a massive overhaul of the armed forces, and ironically, this went largely unnoticed outside of the country. So to keep things short, the build-up in terms of unit and combat power was impressive, with an expansion from 17 brigades to 44 8 years later. Perhaps even more significantly, the reactivation of reserve corps with skeleton brigades, which could be used to reconstitute combat units in a matter of months, a system of operational reserves which allowed to field the active and reserve units with trained soldiers, some attached already to their parent units. We all heard about the territorial defense, which was still very much of a project in early 2022, but still you had the organization, the conceptual skeleton, which made its build-up easier when the invasion came. And perhaps it is important to notice that one of the reasons the Ukrainian rearmament effort was largely unnoticed is simply because Ukraine didn't need to buy much abroad, as it could rely on its own weapon industry and its capability to overhaul older weapon systems, which were stocked and inherited from the Soviet former army. And perhaps more importantly, the doctrine of the Ukrainian army changed. But what was surprising, it was also a reason of this underestimation of the Ukrainians, because they had plenty of NATO advisors who came to train battalions to provide NCO and officers training, help to overhaul the army general staff and so forth. And some NATO commentators found out that the Ukrainians were not so professional, as they were not copy pasting the lessons given. It turned out with insight that actually the Ukrainian officers knew what they were doing. They were taking NATO best practices when it was fitting them, when it was making sense. When it was looking suspicious or unhelpful, they didn't do it, and rather instead emulated the Russian fire reconnaissance complex, even making a better version of it, thanks to also dedicated software such as Kropiva, and continue to be firm believers of artillery, the famed goddess of the battlefield of Stalin. Units were also intensively trained compared to previously. But it would be also a mistake to see the Ukrainian army at large as a perfect organization. I mean, corruption remained an issue, of course, and there was obvious problems of stockpiles, especially in artillery ammunitions, mostly because of this sabotage campaign where several depots blown up during the years preceding the war, and the rearmament was by far not completed. And we can talk about and the Ukrainian couldn't, with such relatively tiny budgets, we are speaking about $3 billion USD per year, we couldn't build up everything at the same time. So in a sense, the air forces had to make do with antiquated combat aircraft such as MiG-29, Sukhoi 27, 25 and 24, which were slightly or a bit modernized, but not that much, and not all of them. And this would have deadly consequences in the beginning of the invasion. But still, we end with quite a powerful Ukrainian army, even if it was not and by far completely mobilized when the Russian reinvasion came. But reserve brigades included. We had 5 tanks and 12 mechanized brigades, 11 missile or artillery or reactive artillery brigades, 7 air assaults, and a few others of different kinds, plus the 24 territorial defense brigades, which were regional commands with 1 per oblast, basically. Plus the Air Force with 125 aircraft and quite a powerful integrated air defense system. So the keynotes of my intervention is not to resume the book, as we had obviously a lot of things to write, but perhaps to emphasize that Ukraine was and Ukraine armed forces were, of course, much less powerful than the Russian ones, but not that much inferior in the end. They were also reasonably well equipped and arguably better trained and quite numerous. So this is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrien. I guess Andrew would be so kind now to let us know about readers' questions.
Yes, sorry, Andrew was having a little trouble getting on stage there, but I'm here now. Yes, we've had quite a few questions from the audience already. I'll make a start just to give people a chance to type anything else that they want to ask. I'll make a start with a few of the questions that we were sent in advance. The first one then is asking what interaction the authors have had with Russian and with Ukrainian contacts since the 24th of February last year, in terms of the information that may have been received.
If you don't mind, I'm going to address this one. What interaction? Most of this is run via internet nowadays, which means similar or the same like social media or via social media, which means exchange of messages, short messages, and there are still ways to contact even if not active, at least retired Russian officers of the Russian armed forces, for example. There are still ways to I mean, not only still ways, but it's much easier in the case of Ukrainians because they are widely present in the social media and readily talking about what are they experiencing. There is something like gentleman's agreement not to go into tactical details, not to go into details about ongoing operations. For example, I might have a contact in a brigade, whatever it was or is, but we are never going to talk about operations for the last 1 month. Also not really about losses, not really about wins or something of that kind, but we are going to talk about events from the last year, which is growing ever more important because plenty of participants of first days of this reinvasion are not alive anymore, are not able to talk with us anymore, or not even willing to talk about all of their experiences.
If I could just actually jump to the questions from the owners, because there was a linked one here. If you give me while I find it so I can pop it back up again. Which was simply to say, have any of the authors been able to visit Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion?
Edward Croter is in Kiev since February this year, but otherwise the other 3 of us not.
No, understood. Thank you. I think going back to the list, you've mentioned, I think the next question was whether there were topics that were taboo, which I think you've already covered there, Tom. But in terms of the contacts and perhaps on both sides, if you're able to comment on this, how do they react to victories, defeats, loss of comrades, loss of loved ones? I mean, clearly it's a very emotional, loaded subject.
It is very emotional. Yes, it is very emotional on both sides, especially the Russians. They are very mad about the entire situation. They consider themselves pushed into this war by the West, and they know that they cannot win. That already since early in the war, I'm talking about 2 or 3 days into the war, they were already aware they cannot win. But they were mad about this situation, this no outlooks situation, so to say. They knew that they cannot win, that they cannot defeat Ukraine, they cannot conquer all of the country and destroy its armed forces or the people. No matter how much they publicly pretend to ignore the Ukrainian nation and the feelings of being Ukrainians in general, or belittle them nowadays. So they are mad about everything. They're furious, but it is strange. They're always blaming somebody else, not themselves, in this regard. There's never any kind of critique, self-critique, or very few of self-critique, very little. That is on the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, there is this dominant determination to push through whatever comes their way. At least the people I'm in touch with. Many are sad because they haven't seen their families for over a year. That is also another impression I have collected over the years.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to go to the audience questions in a minute. Just one, if I can clear up quickly. It's really a question for me, I guess, but I need your permission to respond to it. So Albert asks if he wanted to get in touch with the authors for questions that can't fit into this session or to inform his own work, how could he do so? Now, Tom, your email address I know is on the Helion website. Are you happy for me to post that link in the chat if people wish to follow things up with you? Lovely.
It's no problem.
I'll do that now. So the link I'm posting for anybody that needs it is to the Europe at War homepage, but that has a link which will give you Tom's email address, so you'll be able to pester him to your heart's content, and I'm sure he'll love me for sharing this, but there we go. Right, I'm going to do some audience questions then. Let's just try and make some sense out of this rather than jumping back through different topics. We've answered that one. I'll start then with a few questions about the book itself. So this one from Goran. do you also cover the build-up and operations of Russia Interior Ministry, Rosguardia and FSB forces?
Adrien, would you like?
Yes. We had an emphasis on the Rosguardia specifically because it plays such a crucial role into ensuring the survival of the current regime. And we all know about these Kadyrovists forces and so forth. So yes, they are definitely an important factor in this war.
We have sizable sub-chapters on Rosguardia, on all of its elements, because there is OMON, there is this, there is that, and so on and so on. So Rosguardia as such is in control of multiple sub-organizations. And of course, we couldn't ignore it. We had to cover it. And there are also photographs, of course, of Rosguardia troops, particularly in Kherson, early during the war.
Thanks both. Next one then. From Albert, he says, on the topic of the reconnaissance fires complex, the Russian performance in the early war seemingly fell far short of many Western analysts' extrapolations based on what happened during the Russian intervention in 2015. Has the book's research uncovered any possible reasons for the difference?
This is Adrien.
Mainly is actually it's quite one of the main reasons is this complex is relying a lot on a specific UAV, which is the Orlan 10, and this drone is not functioning well, to say the least, in very cold weather, which in turn is denying the Russians of one of their main tactical reconnaissance asset, and therefore their artillery is losing in precision all the time. And the downside is once the spring comes, then the Orlan 10s are functioning better, and then Russian artillery is gaining into reactivity and precision. You have other aspects during the invasion days, and for if only the logistical problems which plagued the Russians, especially in the north and so on. But the Orlan 10 problem is something which is remaining even now.
Thank you. And sticking with the research then, if I may, with this next one. So it says, when researching Volume 2, what was the largest surprise yielded by the research? This is Albert again. He says, I'm thinking along the lines of the recent disclosure that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's initial contingency headquarters was actually in Hostomel. Biggest surprise?
For me, the biggest surprise was just, Adrien has mentioned this earlier, we have seen all of the incompetence and inabilities and failures in the Russian armed forces already in Syria 2015-16. We have seen the Air Force being unable to bombing, but hitting nothing or very little, or having to fly 50, 60 sorties to hit a specific object. So, but it still came as a big surprise to see exactly the same performance, so to say, in Russia's neighborhood. One would think, okay, in Syria they had a problem with GLONASS system, because this was largely dysfunctional, and it took them months to build up the coverage for the battlefield. It took them over a year to put together a reasonably good intelligence picture to find out who is actually on the other side, whom are they fighting, whom should they bomb, and so on. But it is surprising to see that this is nothing better in this regards in Ukraine. That is, for me, the biggest surprise. Adrien, do you have?
It was really what shocked me the most. It is I recall talking with some military historians who knew, for example, about the Soviet operational art, and everybody was waiting for a second echelon somewhere. But it never came because there never was one, because they rushed everything they got, gambling in an all or nothing bet, like either the Ukrainian either Kiev crumble on its own, or otherwise the war is lost. They gambled on that precisely. It is nearly insane, actually.
I think you've probably pretty much covered this one in that case, Adrien. But just a question from Alejandro here. Did you manage to find evidence if the invasion was foiled by intelligence services? Judging from the idea that the Russian army looks like they were to rush important point, but enters with no operational security, like if they were to parade and occupy, and the opposition to melt down, which I think is basically what you just outlined. So was it just a big misjudgment, or was the intelligence role significant? I think is the question there.
Indication that we have is the whole decision process was made with a very tiny circle of people around Putin himself, and all the intelligence assessments provided within Russia were basically made to please the boss, or to correspond to what the boss wanted to hear. However, we also have to remind ourselves that plenty of Western intelligence assessments were saying the same things as the people pleasers to Putin. That is, Ukrainian cannot resist. It is ready to crumble. So when you see about the Russian invasion, you really have to think in terms of the Danube operation in '68. That is a kind of a high-speed coup d'état, but not entering into an actual war against an enemy nation. It was an external coup d'état.
Takeover, yes. Yeah, it is. I mean, intelligence spoiled. I'm quite sure that the Russians have obtained the same intelligence, well, actually the Western intelligence in this regards, and felt confirmed by it in regards of expectations, Ukrainian government to fold up and run away, and the armed forces to fall apart. Perhaps 2 or 3 units are going to fight, the rest is going to run away, or something of that kind. So if the intelligence was crucial, of course, but the question is what kind of intelligence. On one side, this intelligence was something like best case scenario on the Russian side, and Putin simply accepted this and gambled again, just like in Syria. It worked in Syria, it worked in Ukraine in 2014. It's going to work again, so let's do it again. It's as simple as that.
Oh, thank you, Tom. If I could turn a couple of questions about the air war. Alejandro simply asks, with respect to the book, is the air war covered in detail, and is it possible to do so at this time? And then, rather more specifically, we have a question from Victor, who asks, Ukrainian Air Force confirmed air-to-air kills, ? As far as I know, there is a single realistic claim against a Russian Su-25 by MiG-29 during the first days in the Kiev region, with date and pilot mentioned. Is anything else known? Could you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, sure. If I might start with the second one, this is the only confirmed kill. That's it. Everything else in terms of evidence, there is no link. There might be evidence in terms of something was shot down on that day when something was claimed as shot down, and even officially confirmed as shot down and credited to a pilot, and pilots have been decorated. But in terms of hard evidence, for example, radar tapes or HUD camera videos or something, there is nothing at all. And generally, it is so that neither side is releasing any kind of details about air combats. From time to time, you can find a report of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Our fighters have shot down an enemy MiG-29 or Su-25 or whatever, but that is essentially everything. Neither side is releasing any kind of details in regards of, let's say, closer area where it happened, what ranges were involved, or what range was the missile fired, under what circumstances, how many aircraft were involved, what units were involved, nothing in this regards. So, yes, this one Ukrainian claim from I think it was the first morning of the war, where one of the pilots maneuvered, MiG-29 pilots maneuvered Russian Su-25 into the ground, and then the wreckage of that Su-25 was found. This is something like only confirmed Ukrainian kill. In a similar fashion, there is a video of Ukrainian two-man crew ejecting from their shot down MiG-29 UB. And this is a confirmation for a Russian kill also around the same time. So these are, so to say, the only kills that can be corroborated with evidence from the other side. And the other one might be this Ukrainian Su-27 shot down, I think, was it the second or the third morning of the war over Kiev. There is this famous sequence of photographs or videos where the jet is exploding on the dark sky over skyscraper and falling in flames, and then the wreckage was found. So this was certainly, that was certainly a loss caused by the enemy. The question is, by air-to-air missile or by surface-to-air missile? This remains unknown until today. And the first question was what again?
Just the extent to which the air war is covered in the book, and how much detail that is possible to do that in.
There are orders of battle, and the air warfare is described in the context of ground warfare. So that means as far as directly related to it. But we are intending to go into much more detail, and yes, that is possible, in a separate volume or perhaps two, which is to follow in, I hope, in 1 or 2, perhaps 3 months from now.
Thank you. If we might turn to the groundwork, we have a question from Luca. Now, forgive me, my Italian. I know enough Italian to recognise Italian when I see it, but I have no language skills, so I'm relying on Google Translate here. But if that served me well, the question is, how do you explain the rigidity of the Russian military system? They seem to be incapable of learning and correcting their mistakes. Corrections are minimal and slow. How is all this possible in 2023? And could this be the weak point to be exploited by the Ukrainian side?
Adrien?
Yeah, I understand. I agree with Luca. It was a tremendous surprise for us to see the slowness of Russian adaptation. I mean, this trying again and again to cross the same river, or almost at the same point, savaging their own mechanized formations, trying to pass by, to enter Busha, for just to take one example among many others. My impression, it is linked with this endemic moral corruption which devastated the Russian army thanks to Putin and Putin's associates. But frankly, even Russians are not really understand why. I mean, even right away, Russian citizens are in Russia asking themselves the question: how it is possible? Why are we not evolving at last? That said, the Russian did evolve. The tactics used in Bakhmut are a far cry for what we saw in the beginning of the war. The VKS, so the Air Force, remains very much functional, so it is also adapting this tactics. So there is a clear Ukrainian tactical superiority, but we need to be a bit careful about that. I mean, it is not that that the Russians are just utterly stupid and universally incompetent. I mean, they do have a problem of a power structure which is literally fighting against its own army in a sense. But we shall also keep in mind that Russian and Soviet Union history is full of cases when precisely this began to change very quickly too.
There's generally a problem. Just to add something, there is generally a problem with the system Putin, what we call system Putin, this system of endemic corruption at the top. And as long as this system does not want to reform, there is no serious reform of the armed forces is possible either. And because of the system Putin, there is also no option or no possibility of a reform in the defense sector. So it goes to the entire society, up to the armed forces and back. And because of this, the Russians simply cannot reform and learn from their mistakes in general, in grand total. In detail, tactically, they do learn from their mistakes, and they have already formed their armed forces from a massive mechanized formation to heavy infantry formations. But this is, of course, not really helping them continue advancing in big style or something of that kind. And as Adrien has addressed it, it is also so that the Russian Air Force is learning. It cannot do much more simply because it's all the time under the command and control of ground forces. So it's not even expected and not trained and not equipped to do more than it is doing. But it is learning, and it is time and again is doing very well. And then it's heavily felt, for example, in Avdiivka sector the last few weeks. This is, however, something where we are moving into discussing the air warfare, which is going to be covered in future volumes. It is early during the war, there was this simple coup attempt, more or less, overrun the Ukrainian civilian authorities. The armed forces are going to run away, and that's it. And that's what they tried to do, and it didn't work.
Thank you, Tom. We've got time for probably about 3 or 4 more questions. I've got quite a few here on aspects of the Ukrainian forces, so I thought we could finish with those, if that's all right with the two of you.
Oh, sure.
The first one from Steve is just a very a straightforward order of battle question, but he asks, what is the typical strength of a Ukrainian brigade? Are they regiment equivalents or battalion strength groups? Or
I think this is for Adrien.
Pre-wars, for example, a standard mechanized brigade had 3 mechanized battalion, 1 tank battalion, a very powerful artillery group with two artillery battalions plus multiple rocket launcher battalions plus AAA and other units. So it was quite powerful formations, and actually they were very similar to Russian similar units. And it's the other way around for a tank brigade with 3 tank battalions, 1 mechanized battalion, and so forth for the artillery. And besides of that, the Ukrainians had plenty of less potent brigades, such as motorized infantry, marines, airborne, which were usually had to do with a tank company, or perhaps in better case tank battalion, and for most much less artillery. So altogether, I would say something like 12 first-tier units, heavily mechanized and extremely powerful, and then a second tier of lighter units.
Thank you. Getting into rather more detail then with this next one from Victor. In fact, this is in 2 parts. He asks, why was there no defence of the Crimean Isthmus at all? A comparatively small number of troops in well-prepared defensive positions with ATGM and some tank and artillery support could have held the Russian advance for enough time to allow mobilisation and avoid most of the south being conquered, like they held in the Donbass. And to follow up from that, why wasn't the, if you forgive, Antonovsky bridge in Kherson blown up like many bridges in the north? Well, get your teeth into that one, gents.
Adrien, do you want to try that one, or shall I?
No, you can. I will complete after
Okay.
a while.
Generally, on one side, it is obvious that the Ukrainians didn't expect any kind of attacks, major ground advances in north and in the south. So they were taken by surprise. They did expect an onslaught in the east. That is on one side. On the other side, there is definitely some sort of treachery behind all of this, because even they have mobilized their troops around 5 or 6 days before, their armed forces, 5 or 6 days before the re-invasion. And what did they do with units that were mobilized? They sent them to the east, to the LOC, while no units at all were sent to the south or to the north. So the question is then, who was bringing decisions about in these regards? And I've been asking this question to lots of Ukrainians and lots of Ukrainian armed forces, officers of Ukrainian armed forces, and nobody wants to talk about this issue. They all say, "Now we are going to discuss this after the war." So, and there's going to be an investigation and this and that. They're announcing, but they do not do anything strict in this regards. If at all, civilians are always explaining, "No, we should prosecute somebody in the intelligence service and so on and so on." But the intelligence service is not taking decisions. Where is what brigade going to be sent or deployed? For example, the brigade which was mobilized only a few days before 24th of February, mobilized in the Novakakovka area, was put on war footing, and instead of being kept there in Novakakovka, which is such a crucial position on Dnipro, it was sent to northeastern Ukraine. So there are simply plenty of questions which are unexplainable right now, because nobody is ready to talk about them in Ukraine. Adrien?
No, it's okay. It is still a part of the war which is remaining easy. I just have a narration of the sizing of the Antonov Bridge in Kherson by VDV, but that's all basically. So it's true that at least this testimony of VDV and CO advancing all the way to Kherson. So it's quite ironic, because he's describing quite a messy Russian advance. Actually, everything is unorganized, but he's describing evidence of literally Ukrainian being surprised or strafed or running away, withdrawing in catastrophe. So something big happened, but details remain hazy, at least for me.
There is, in chapter 8 of our book, there is a description of a naval infantry brigade, a large part of which was sent to the area immediately north of Crimean Isthmus. Excuse me. And what happened, they were sent there for exercises a few days before the war, but without any kind of heavy weapons. So when the Russians invaded, they drove all the way to Novakakovka and to Antonovsky Bridge, and they were there before the Ukrainians could flee back to Kherson and Mykolaiv. So obviously either there was ultimate incompetence on the Ukrainian side or massive volumes of treachery in this regards, because it is absolutely incredible that to send a unit for training without heavy weapons just a few days before an invasion, and that upon mobilization of the armed forces. So, excuse me.
Thank you, Tom. I'm conscious we've got a lot of excellent questions, and I think we could probably be here all night. But to save you from talking yourselves hoarse, I'm just going to stick it to the last two. This one, something a little bit different. The question from Tassos, who says, "Do we have any assessment regarding the amount and quality of NATO intelligence targeting info being delivered to Ukraine, both air and ground?"
Well, there is no precise data in terms of NATO is tracking so and so many Russian aircraft or tanks or units or so on. But what the NATO can do, and it's doing very well, is to follow patterns in Russian military traffic, and is supplying corresponding information. There are assessments. Okay, they say, look, in this and that area, the Russians have moved so and so many trucks over the last 24 hours. Or last 36 or 48 or whatever hours. This means they have unit size of this and that, in that direction, and they're probably preparing for something in this area. this is what is working. What is also working very well is early warning from Russian airstrikes, which means ballistic missile strikes and cruise missile strikes, because here the NATO, I mean, primarily Americans, have excellent early warning systems which are detecting, for example, ballistic missiles right on the launch, and within 2 or 3 minutes forwarding the information to whether to Washington, to Brussels, or to Kiev. And similarly, AWACS aircraft, particularly the one which is orbiting, there is one always on orbit over Romania. They are picking Russian cruise missiles as soon as they approach the eastern coast of the Black Sea. So things are working over there. There is no doubt about this. Just in regards of what kind of detailed information is moving forward, there is less information in this regards.
Thank you. Right, last question then you'll be pleased to hear, I'm sure, before we wrap things up. But I'll read this one out in full. I thought you'd appreciate the comment at the beginning. This is from Alona. She says, first of all, thank you, Mr. Cooper, for your everyday work and analysis, and no doubt to Adrien as well. Even for me as Ukrainian, it's hard to find qualitative information about what is really going on here. So my question is, what are your thoughts about a long-announced counterattack by Ukraine? How effective can it be, especially regarding intelligence information leaks in the last days in the USA, where USA officials are quite skeptical about its success?
Okay. Let's start with the start. Thank you very much for joining us from Ukraine, and thank you very much. I appreciate all the attention in this regards of my coverage, which eventually is always going into our books as well. To address your question, I do not consider any kind of large-scale offensive currently possible. It is we see that Ukrainian armed forces are still experiencing all sorts of problems with just trying to stop or holding off continuous Russian assaults, and we see that there is not enough ammunition, there is not enough heavy infantry weapons, there are not enough UAVs, there is not enough intelligent weapons, so to say. There's not enough ability to cause massive losses to the Russians while minimizing own losses. Plenty of what Ukrainian armed forces are achieving is still paid in blood, which is unnecessary, because there is weaponry which would enable the Ukraine to outfight the Russians, outgun the Russians, literally. So unless this changes, I do not see any kind of major strikes or major offensives, counter-offensives, or whatever taking place. And this is going to take a few months longer, at least.
Yeah, thank you. Adrien, did you want to add anything to that, or are we?
No, I agree with Tom. I mean, there is always these headlines about future decisive offensive or delivery of F-16 or whatsoever, and we are never talking about the basics. We are sadly and tragically lacking for the Ukrainians, beginning with 155 millimeters artillery shells, and so we can dream about some spectacular solution coming out of the blue, but the war is waged the way it is, and Ukrainians need firepower, and right now, right away, not lost into talks between I don't know how many MODs talking in Brussels or somewhere else. So.
Thank you both.
There's not in this regards, in regards of ammunition supply, nothing is going to change for months, at least for 5 or 6 months in advance. In regards of heavy infantry weapons, nothing can change in regards to such issues, because it takes time for the industry to pick up and to manufacture enough of them. So when you have the politics which is reacting only now, 1 year after the reinvasion, then of course it takes time for the industry to react. If the politics would have reacted already last year in, let's say, March or April or May, things would have been different. But now the chances are over for a quick conclusion of this war. Now it's going to take different means to empower Ukraine enough for a counteroffensive. So excuse me for interruption. Thank you very much, Andrew.
No, not at all. I was only about to thank you. I mean, the honesty, I'm sure, is appreciated by the audience. It's refreshing for me, who gets my Ukraine war news from the newspapers, to hear experts tell it how it is, and it's the same logistical issues that come to play in the wars I write about in my day job. So it's thank you for all the insights. I say we could probably have gone until midnight with all the questions, and I'm sorry if I haven't read out everyone's. I can see there's been a fair bit of exchanges in the main chat, so it's great that people are talking amongst themselves. With that in mind, I'm going to close down the session in a minute. I'll leave the chat up for a few minutes more, just if people want to say their farewells and to swap emails and pick things up. But if you found the applause function yet, I'm sure if you'd like to give our two speakers a big hand there. I'll post up again before we finish the discount code for anybody that doesn't have the book. But in a moment, I will take myself and the speakers off the screen, and Tom and Adrien can go and have a well-deserved drink and relax after an excellent presentation, which I hope you've all enjoyed. But on behalf of Helion, thank you to the speakers, and thank you to the audience for listening.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody for coming this
evening. Everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, then all.